Does that help? You had something.
Well, this may sound kind of weird, but I'm trying to picture these guys writing their gospels. You know, what they do, pull out a bunch of papyrus or whatever, and just start jotting down notes or whatever. I mean, how long did it take them to do it? And then when they completed it, what did they do with it? I mean, where did it go from there?
Okay.
Take to the publisher?
Okay, fair enough. I'll talk a little bit about this. So, back in those days, if we go back 2,000 years before the time of Christ, people had, they would take blocks of clay, and I don't have a pen, so pretend I'm holding a pen, and they would take an instrument, a writing instrument with a sharp point, and they would work with wedge-shaped, with stick shapes. And part of the reason we know they did this is when they would have a fire, it would bake the clay tablets and preserve them in these dry parts of the world. And so, back in the time of Moses, that's how people did things. The time of Abraham was the late Bronze Age. And by the time of David, it was the Iron Age. And so, basically, we moved from writing on stone. You mentioned papyrus. That was one of the first kinds of paper that we used. So by the time of the gospel writers, people wrote on animal skins, they wrote on papyrus, and they wrote on something called vellum, which is cloth fibers interspersed with like cotton and wood, and basically really fancy versions of what we have now, and they were really hard to get. It's kind of the Rolls Royce, like most people have cars nowadays, but how many people really have like those, I can't think of what they're called, those signature style cars that are worth like $500,000? Well, that's kind of how this stuff was back then. It was really hard to get writing materials, but if you could get a sponsor, somebody who would work with you and furnish you materials. So we tend to have this image, and even these two movies, the Matthew movie and the John movie, they give you this image that this guy is standing around and he's talking and he's got his scribes writing things down. Maybe that's the way it was. Or you've got a guy who's sitting there and he's writing. It very likely was a process. Like, for example, let me talk about Luke, because we know a little bit more about how Luke did it just based on the fact that he did it in a standard kind of Greek way. So basically, Paul, very likely, he found some of Jesus' surviving aunts and uncles, and he had interviews. And he either took notes or he just had a really good memory, and he would kind of put those materials to one side. And then he might have gotten his hands on a copy of Mark or a copy of Matthew or both, and then he kind of lays it out and he kind of starts to figure out, what story do I want to tell? What's the point I'm trying to make? So for example, Luke very carefully researched his materials so that we don't just start with Jesus. We don't even just start with Mary. We've got the parents of John the Baptist in the story. He went out of his way to talk to people. So in his case, he wrote it much like a history would have been written back then. With Mark, it sounds very much like, if you want to say, Uncle Peter told him a lot of stories, and so he finally started writing some of it down, and he got it out there, and people started using it before maybe it was even ready, because we have a very hard time creating a good outline for Mark, because the stories kind of jump a bit. It's well told, but it doesn't seem to have as much forethought ahead of time for how it's going to be structured, and like half of the gospel is about a single week, a 7-day period. So, whereas Matthew, man, it really looks like he created some piles of paper. Like, it's entirely possible he was writing stuff down while Jesus was giving his sermons, because anybody who's a traveling minister would tell you that they have to repeat a lot of the same things over and over, at different places that they go, especially in a world where nobody has a way to record what he's saying. He's got to say many of the same things many places he goes. So it's very likely Matthew was writing stuff down and eventually had a big enough list that he very likely, for example, had that Sermon on the Mount put together and the sending out of the disciples and the parables of the kingdom set up before he ever started drafting them and putting them into a gospel. So each of the writers, based on the way they wrote and what we know about the world back then, probably came at it a slightly different way. It's almost like asking me, how does one write a term paper? Well, there's those of us who start working on it on the first day, and then there's those of us that cram at the last minute. And then there's those of us who go to the library and we get as many sources as possible, and then there's those of us that are trying to restructure the lecture we heard. Because people are people. As far as how quickly they got out, within a generation they were very far. And it's interesting because other people did attempt to write gospels. People have probably heard of the Gospel of Thomas. And there was a Gospel of Mary and a Gospel of Peter. But what happened is, and now we're delving a little bit into exactly how inspiration works, which is a little bit like asking how exactly does God love us. We're not going to get very close. We can just try to know a little more than we did. From what we can tell, although more than 4 Gospels were written, only the 4 that we have circulated far enough and had enough of an effect on people over a large enough area over a long enough period of time that everyone said, we have to hang on to these. People's lives are being changed. And near the end of the disciples' lives, it's very likely like, yes, I give my blessing to this one. So if you had an apostle, give it his stamp of authority. If it spread far and wide and continued to remain effective, those are some of the stamps and so that's the closest I can come to giving you a ballpark answer for how these things got assembled and how they got out. Does that help, Rob?
Yeah, that's a lot.
Okay.